Know Thyself, a philosophical maxim that originated in ancient Greece and has been explored and revered by philosophers for thousands of years. There are many ways in which we can come to better understand ourselves, whether by engaging in deep personal reflection or by pondering the ultimate depths of the universe and of reality itself. But an even deeper question lies within it. What is the self? How can we come to know the self if we aren't even really sure what the self is? In this video, I will be discussing St. Thomas Aquinas and his understanding of what the self is and how it is that we come to know ourselves. I will begin by introducing St. Thomas Aquinas' background so that we can have a bit of a better understanding of how his thoughts took shape over time. Next, I'll introduce several claims and arguments that he makes on the nature of the soul, and then I will address how Aquinas' definition of the soul is synonymous with his idea of the self. Finally, I will explain how Aquinas believes it is possible to understand the self and what it means to know thyself. So, who was Thomas Aquinas? St. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican friar, philosopher, and theologian who was born in Aquino, Italy in 1225 AD. Aquinas was brought up in the Catholic Church by his parents, but when he was 19 years old, he decided to move to Paris, France to study theology and philosophy under the Dominican Brotherhood. Aquinas was heavily influenced by Aristotle, whom he refers to throughout all of his works as simply the philosopher. Aquinas built on Aristotle's ideas, particularly the idea that all things that are in effect have a cause and there is a sort of purpose or essence to everything in the world. He applied this to Christian theology, arguing that even abstract ideas like the soul have a purpose, connecting divine faith and reason. And Aquinas' legacy has become exactly that. He is a philosopher and a theologian who is able to reconcile Christian theology and scientific reason, and not only show that they aren't so different and completely mutually exclusive, but rather they're actually complementary to one another. However, Aquinas did still believe that faith was the sort of cornerstone of the Christian religion when he writes, quote, "To one who has faith, no explanation is necessary, for he knows by the light of faith itself. To one who does not have faith, no explanation is possible, for whatever can be said about the articles of faith cannot be proved by natural reason," end quote. So nearly all of the information and the philosophy provided in this video is going to be coming out of Suma Theologica. It's his seminal work. It is thousands of pages long. I kind of only focused on the first two books and even really just the first book in this video. But he provides hundreds of questions and objections to those questions and then answers to those objections. So to honor Aquinas and his style, I will be following a similar format, and I'll begin now by asking the first question. So, is the self not just the mind and therefore the brain? There are sort of two major camps that people tend to fall into. Either you believe in substance dualism or non-dualism. In dualism, you believe that the mind and the body are separate entities, the body being material and the mind being immaterial. Or you believe in non-dualism, where the mind is like the byproduct of the brain, and the brain is just the body, so it's really all one substance. Aquinas was a substance dualist, but his understanding of the mind or the intellect can be better understood by his initial understanding of the soul. First, we have to understand Aristotle's theory of hylomorphic composites. A hylomorphic composite is anything that is made up of matter and form. The word hylomorphism comes from the Greek hyle, which means matter, and morphe, which means form. So in the case of humans, matter is the physical substance, like the body, and form is the immaterial substance, like the soul or the mind or the intellect. And these can also be categorized into states of potentiality or actuality. Potentiality is what something could be, and actuality is when something realizes its full potential. So in the case of humans, the body would be pure potentiality because it's not quite a human yet, it just has the potential to become one. The form or the soul, on the other hand, is actuality, because when combined with the body, it is the thing that makes it actually a human. You can think of the soul as the spark that brings the body to life in the same way that a key turns on a car's engine, right? The body is the potential, but it's the soul that makes everything work. Without it, the body would just be a corpse sitting there like a parked car with no key to turn it on. Aquinas takes on this Aristotelian view in which he believes that the soul, or the anima as he would have called it, is the principle of life and actualization of the material body. He writes, quote, "As the philosopher says, The soul is the first act of a physical body which has life potentially, end quote. Like I mentioned earlier, Aquinas believes that every effect has an initial cause. He calls the animating soul the first act, meaning it is the principle of what causes matter, or the body, to become an actualized human being. This concept of dualism has been made popular by other philosophers like Plato and René Descartes, but they differ from Aquinas in a couple of ways. Plato's dualism, which is primarily found in his works The Phaedo or The Republic, asserts a very sharp distinction between the soul and the body. Plato believes, like Aquinas, that the soul is immortal, eternal, and the seat of true knowledge and reason. For Plato, the soul pre-exists the body and will continue to exist after the body dies. The body, however, being material and corruptible, is only a sort of distraction for the soul. The body is often described in Plato's works as a prison that inhibits the soul's pursuit of truth. True wisdom, Plato argues, is only achieved when the soul is freed from the prison of the body at death. René Descartes' dualism, as he articulates in his Meditations on First Philosophy, offers a more modern and sort of mechanistic view of the distinction between mind and body. Descartes identifies the soul with the mind, which is entirely separate from the body. The soul is defined by its ability to think. Cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. The body, however, is a machine-like entity that is governed by physical laws, entirely distinct from the mind. Descartes believes that the soul actually resides in a physical place in the body, and he believes that it is right here in the pineal gland. He calls it the seat of the soul. It is the physical place where the soul resides in the body, playing it like a kind of instrument, like, driving a big mechanical meat suit. And for Descartes, that's all the body is. It's just this complex instrument which the soul manipulates to navigate life. Aquinas' approach to dualism, however, is a little bit more nuanced. For Aquinas, the soul is the substantial form of the human body. It gives the body life and purpose, actualizing its potential to be a living, rational, breathing human being. The soul is immaterial and immortal, but it is not naturally separable from the body in the way that Plato or Descartes thinks it is. Instead, he sees the body as integral to the human person. While the soul can exist without the body after death and maybe even benefit from it because it's not like tethered to its, flesh prison, he believes that this state is temporary and unnatural. The ultimate goal is the reunion of body and soul upon resurrection. And on the topic of bodily resurrection, he writes, quote, "All things being equal, the state of the soul in the body is more perfect than outside the body, because it is a part of the whole composite," end quote. So next question. We know that the soul is necessary for the body, but is the soul independent of the body? Can it possibly exist on its own? Great question. Aquinas has a pretty long-winded answer, so bear with me. I'm going to explain it as soon as we're done. He writes, quote, "Therefore the intellectual principle which we call the mind or the intellect has an operation per se apart from the body. Now only that which subsists can have an operation per se. For nothing can operate but what is actual, for which reason we do not say that heat imparts heat, but that what is hot gives heat. We must conclude therefore that the human soul, which is called the intellect or the mind, is something incorporeal and subsistent," end quote. All right, let's break this down. So Aquinas believes that our souls have a capacity for thinking independent of the body. And this is because souls are able to conceive of universal concepts outside of our body's ability to perceive them via some form of sensation. So he gives the example that it is not heat that gives off heat, but rather it is something hot that gives off heat. So heat can be perceived by the body via physical sensations, but it must be internalized by the soul in order to be identified, recognized, and understood by the body, like what's going on. The body only recognizes sensations, but it is the soul that understands the forms or the universal concepts that those sensations are indicative of. Another long quote, Aquinas writes, quote, "Now a thing is known in as far as its form is in the knower. But the intellectual soul knows a thing in its nature absolutely. For instance, it knows a stone absolutely as a stone, and therefore the form of a stone absolutely, as to its proper formal idea is in the intellectual soul," end quote. So he gives the example that a soul recognizes a stone as a stone absolutely. What does that mean? Basically, he's saying when you see a stone in nature, you're not recognizing it as a stone because it's that specific piece of material rock sitting right there that the sensation of your vision is perceiving. You're actually recognizing it as the form of a stone that you have seen everywhere, right? In Platonistic terms, one could say that the soul as a form is recognizing the form of the stone rather than the individual material stone itself. Aquinas concludes by saying, quote, "It follows, therefore, that the intellectual soul and every intellectual substance which has knowledge of forms absolutely is exempt from composition of matter and form." End quote. You got it, Aggie. Come here, come here. You can do it. You can do it. Come here. Come here. I don't have time for this. So think about it another way. Your mind is able to conceive of things that it doesn't know actually exist in the material world. You can conceive of God, angels, universal concepts, consciousness, infinity, all of these things that don't materially exist, but your mind still has a perfect grasp on them. Aquinas believes that this is evidence that the soul must exist independently of the body, since it essentially performs functions that the material body could never achieve through mere sensations alone. What this means for us as we try to understand the self is that Aquinas believes things are defined by their forms. The way that we understand a stone as being a stone absolutely is the same way that we understand a human by their soul, by their form, and not by their body. So Aquinas shows that the soul animates the body and it exists independently of the body. So what happens to the soul, aka yourself, when your body dies? Well, ultimately, Aquinas goes on to argue, like Plato and many other ancients did, that the soul is incorruptible because it is a form and is in no way material. Because the soul exists without the body, which is corruptible via death, the soul must continue to exist outside of the body. Not only must it continue to exist after the body dies, but like the Platonists believed, it's actually better for the soul to be untethered to the body. This way it will be able to understand things better without the body getting in the way. However, Aquinas has a slightly different approach to Plato's desire to be freed from his flesh prison. Aquinas believes that the divine creation of the human composite as a whole benefits from this unification of soul and body. Aquinas writes, quote, "In that case, however, the union of soul and body would not be for the soul's good, for evidently it would understand worse in the body than out of it, but for the good of the body, which would be unreasonable since matter exists on account of the form and not the form for the sake of the matter." End quote. Okay, so let's really quickly recap everything that we've said here. Based on Aquinas' claims, we can conclude 5 things. 1, the soul is the principle of life and the form of the body. The body depends on the soul, while the soul does not necessarily depend on the body, but their unification is a good thing. 2nd, the soul is immaterial, and due to its immaterial nature, it is capable of grasping, hey, what's up, kitty? It's capable of grasping things like forms and universal concepts like God. 3rd, since the soul is immaterial and capable of grasping the concept of forms, it must be the soul that thinks and understands and not the brain or any other organ in the body. 4th, the soul is incorruptible and survives the body after death. 5th, and finally, while the soul is able to understand better outside of the body, it's actually seen as less perfect than the unification of soul and body together. So our final question: since the self is the soul, how can the soul come to know thyself? As we have seen, Aquinas identifies the self with the intellectual soul, which is the immaterial, God-given essence of a human being. For Aquinas, this immaterial nature is the basis of how the soul comes to know itself. Because the soul can grasp universal forms, and it is a universal form itself, it is uniquely equipped to turn inward and understand its own immaterial nature. But it's not quite that simple. It's kind of a 2-step process. He writes, quote, "Therefore, the intellect knows itself not by its essence, but by its act. This happens in 2 ways. In the first place, singularly, as when Socrates or Plato perceives that he has an intellectual soul, because he perceives that he understands. In the second place, universally, as when we consider the nature of the human mind from knowledge of the intellectual act." So, what does this mean exactly? First off, there's a sort of self-awareness that the soul possesses simply by being, by existing. Because the soul is immaterial and intellectual, it is present to itself in all of its daily operations. In this sense, the soul is always implicitly known to itself in the background. But secondly, there is an explicit sort of self-knowledge that the soul comes to understand by contemplating itself and by going through physical actions. For example, the intellect might inquire into its own nature, asking questions like, what am I? Where have I come from? What is the purpose of my existence? Where am I going? And Aquinas addresses these epistemological mechanics of self-knowledge. He denies that the soul is a simple form in a vacuum or some isolated essence existing on its own. Instead, he believes that self-knowledge arises when the soul is inherently active. Through these activities, the soul directly encounters itself not as an object distinct from its operations, but as the subject through which they occur. Ultimately, this reflective knowledge is a higher order awareness and allows the soul to articulate its immaterial nature and its relationship to God as its ultimate source. This is where Aquinas' view of self-knowledge becomes very theological. He holds that the soul's capacity for self-knowledge, its ability to understand itself, is a direct byproduct of its creation by God. In understanding itself, the soul also comes to recognize its dependence on God, who is the ultimate source of all being and all creation. He quotes St. Augustine's De Trinitate, quote, "We gaze on the inviolable truth whence we can as perfectly as possible define, not what each man's mind is, but what it ought to be in the light of the eternal types." End quote. This ties into Aquinas' broader metaphysical framework in which all knowledge, whether of the external world, of the self, or God, is ultimately grounded in its relationship to the divine. So, how do we come to know ourselves? Well, for Aquinas, the soul's ability to know itself is not only a mark of its immateriality, but also a reflection of its divine origin. This ability positions the soul uniquely in creation as being capable of self-awareness, intellectual reflection, and ultimately, a direct relationship with God. And this, for Aquinas, is how we come to know thyself. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like and consider subscribing if you enjoy seeing this kind of stuff. I would also really appreciate it if you shared this video with someone else who you think would really benefit from it. Maybe you have a paper coming up on Aquinas and you need to write something, and you can steal all of my ideas if you like. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.